third one, so the second one is why, so focusing on your audience from a why they would want to listen to you perspective. And then a little bit about pre-work, how you connect with people, perhaps prior to a presentation, a meeting, or whatever, which we might have forgotten to do, something which we do more naturally in the live workplace, but still really important. And strange enough, it's really important to do not in the video form. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about emotion, pathos, and I'll explain those words in more detail, but it's about how you need to use more of this in connecting with your audience virtually than you might do when you're just connecting with them face to face. And lastly, being more inventive, perhaps mixing your media wherever you can to engage the audience even more. So I've got some practical tips there, but I want to start with these principles. And the reason I want to start with these principles is because although I could just give you the tips, my experience is that if you give somebody a tip, they might do it. If you give somebody a tip and then you give them a really interesting connection as to why that works, they're quite likely to use it in the future. And I hope that will work with you. So let's think about some of the foundations and the principles, pretty much all communication actually. And the first one is deeply depressing, I'm afraid, especially if your job, like me, is sometimes to do communication to people. The first one is that basically your audience isn't listening to you. Most of the time the audience is not listening. That's just normal. It's not you personally, it's just the way that we all are. We get very easily distracted with our chimpanzee brains. Secondly, even if they are listening, they're entirely making it up themselves. And thirdly, both of these are much worse when you're in the sort of virtual environment. So whilst you may be up against it anyway during a normal communication session, you are particularly up against it when it comes to virtual communications. Therefore, you have to be even more focused on how you come across. The second key principle I'd like you to consider is about stop thinking it's about being right. Now, I worked in procurement. I was a procurement director for many years, and I have to say, I think one of the challenges young people sometimes have is that they are both right and unheard. So they sometimes present stuff that is true, but for some reason it doesn't resonate because they think, well, surely people will get it because I'm right. And that's not enough. When you're presenting factual data, however good the factual data is, you've actually got two parts to your message. You've got the data itself, that's essentially what you are saying. So the facts, if you will. And the second part of this is the deliverer. This is who and how. Who's delivering it and how are they delivering it? Now, there is a tendency that most people have to believe on this simplistic diagram that most of it's down the data end, i.e. if I'm right and the data's good, yeah, there'll be a bit of my credibility in there, but at the end of the day, the data will speak for itself. And I don't believe that to be true. I actually believe that you're far down the other end, where actually most of what you will do, the impact that you will have, will be determined by who you are and how you deliver it, and only a small percentage by the actual data itself. So that's quite a challenging thought, but it also means that you need to think about how you're presenting it online. That who and how is very much about your brand, what you're like, maybe as a department, maybe as a company, maybe as an individual. All of these will have a part to play in the effect it has on factual data. Your brand, the who and how, is really important. This idea of creation, not reception, is pretty transformatory once you get it and start working with it. So the idea is, whatever you're saying is essentially received like a black box. You have input, you then receive it, and then you give some output. But your brain is essentially a black box. It's receiving a bunch of stimuli. And then it's creating, based on experience, what that means. It says, okay, I think you just said that. But the process is essentially creation, not reception. Now, there's lots of fun ways of demonstrating this. Again, there's all sorts of things on the internet. This is a quick one, just about this concept of the power that we as these individuals have to essentially make things up. Here you've got an image which I hope you can all see clearly on the screen, which is a kind of, it's like one of those flip phones or a folded box being opened up. And I would believe, because I've shown this to many, many audiences all around the world, that almost everybody in the audience will see that image and they will see that there is a vaguely dark grey box sitting on top of a vaguely light grey box. That's what we see. Now, the interesting thing is when you get a colour bar, and I'm going to click a colour bar and bring it across, an interesting thing happens when you start looking at it. Because when you bring this colour bar across and you place it over the middle of the image, what you actually see is that in the centre of the top square, you can't see the edges of the colour bar because they're the same colour. But interestingly, in the bottom square, they are also the same colour. Now that's a simple optical illusion. The reason I like this particular optical illusion is that even though you now know the centre of the top and the centre of the bottom square are the same colour, for about 95% of people, it still looks different. And that's because we're creating an image based on rules that we make up in our own head, even though we're presented with clear evidence that it's not the case. This is powerful stuff. Creation is powerful stuff. Non-face-to-face, so this sort of thing, unfortunately makes all of this creation process much worse. And it's down to some very critical subconscious effects that the internet and video calling, etc., has on us, which is why we often feel very tired when we've done lots of video meetings and conferences. And it's based on a couple of things that cause us to be stressed. One's called no gap, the other's called no overlap. And these are normal, subconscious, conversational things that we have as humans when we communicate. No gap is that moment where when you're talking to somebody and there's an awkward silence before they answer. If there is a tiny silence before they answer, in general, we don't believe them or we think that they're foolish. That just happens. Likewise, if people speak over each other, then that can also cause stress, and you really need no better example than the recent presidential debates to show how bad that can feel if there are constant overlaps. And unfortunately, in this media where you have many people in a meeting, or even 4 or 5 people in a meeting, there's often lots of overlap speaking because we don't pick up the visual cues that show somebody's about to speak. So this causes stress during these types of meetings and presentations, and that stress means I'm listening less. So that's why this is quite important. Now we know that from phone calls that we're making where it keeps breaking up and you get very stressed when you can't hear the other person, and it happens a lot, but you still get stressed by it. But the interesting thing when you come down to these sorts of things, maybe when we're sat with a decent camera and all that good stuff, it still causes some subconscious effects. And that's just because of the technology. Originally, the technology that causes us to send information, invented by the American Army, is all about packaging it. You sort of kind of package up the electronic information, you send it, and then you depackage it on your own computer. That's what happens. Unfortunately, in that process, even with the best internet, there's a delay. Not much, about 150 milliseconds on packing it and about 150 milliseconds on packing it. That means even with the very best internet connection, you've got a delay there in the to and fro of conversation of about 300 milliseconds. Now, why is this important? Well, it's simple. Because if you have a 400 millisecond gap, which is a blink of an eye, it causes people to feel concerned. It's like, oh, did they believe what I said there? I'll just check that again. If your internet's a bit slower and it comes down to, let's say, 600-700 milliseconds, actually you think you disbelieve what they're saying. This is powerful subconscious pull on our believability. And secondly, a lovely piece of research, not related to this, but now being seen as relevant to this, is a very simple physical thing, and that's if the image you get is poor, you will tend to disbelieve either what you're reading or what you're seeing. And there was this lovely example that was done in psychological labs for testing people that had a camel and a giraffe. And the statement that they wrote down for people was this simple statement: the giraffe can go longer without water than a camel. And it can. This is a true statement. But what they did was they presented to people that same statement, but then to another group they presented the same statement, but a little bit fainter. And then another group,